My father was very strict as well. So it really played out in a very immediate kind of way in my family. I had a father who thought he was extremely liberated, but actually still held on to some very traditional ideas about women, and, other kinds of ideas from India. And then I had my mum who played good cop to my dad's bad cop. So it was, my teen years were really tough. And I really didn't like my father a lot when I was growing up. And I really shunned the kind of Indian side of me. I was very embarrassed by it. But of course, as you get older, you start to embrace it a lot more, which is precisely the theme of Here Out West, my chapter, which I know you've seen.
You're listening to Who Is My Neighbour, a podcast by You Belong Australia. Each episode, you'll join with Sorgal and Warren to meet some of Australia's newest neighbours. You'll hear their stories, listen to their hopes and dreams, and discover the incredible courage and inspiration they bring to our communities and richly diverse Australian culture. You'll also learn from some more established Aussies too, and the joy they've found living and working alongside our refugee and migrant background neighbours.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Who Is My Neighbour. Thanks for joining us. Today we're going to be speaking with Bina Bhattacharya, who is an actor, writer, producer, who's been involved in a lot of different creative endeavours in her home in Western Sydney. Today we're going to chat to her about a new film coming out called Here Out West, written by a number of different writers from different language and cultural backgrounds, and Bina is one of them. And she wrote one section of this movie that is brought together into a very, very intriguing tale. So we're going to be asking Bina about her history, hear a little bit about her life story, about her involvement in this movie, and about the message that she's really trying to portray through the characters that she's put together into an important chapter in this movie. I hope you enjoy listening to Bina. Well, Bina, welcome, and thank you for joining us on Who Is My Neighbour?
It's great to be here. Thank you for having me.
Oh, it's a pleasure. Throughout this past year or so, we've been on this podcast talking to people who are either from different backgrounds, language and cultural backgrounds, or who have friends who are from different language and cultural backgrounds. Really, we're just trying to help other people hear more stories about people, where they're from, what their background is, and things like that. So I'd love it, Bina, if you could just tell us a little bit about your own background.
I'd love to. So, there's many ways I can answer this. The very simple answer is I'm mixed race. My father was born in Calcutta in 1939 and moved to Manchester in the 60s, and then came to Australia to pursue a career as an academic in 1968, very shortly after the end of the White Australia policy. Mm-hmm. My mother was born in Adelaide in 1947 and is white. Her name is Ellen Mary McEwen, so very kind of Anglo-Celtic. I grew up in Sydney. I have an older sister, so I consider myself a mixed race person. And growing up, my identity was never very clear cut. My friends at school either had two Indian parents, because there was a big South Asian community at my school that I went to in Western Sydney, or they had, two white parents. I kind of didn't really know many other people who sort of had families like mine. Yeah. But as an adult, I married another mixed race person, which is really interesting. So my husband's mother was born in the Philippines and his father was born in Scotland. So very similar. And we compare notes about being mixed race, and we have two children together. We live in a very multicultural neighborhood. And I also work for a youth theatre company in Fairfield in Western Sydney, which has the highest number of newly arrived refugees. So it's questions around identity and assimilation and diaspora are a very big part of my life. It's sort of something I'm constantly contending with as a writer and as a parent, and also as in the work that I do in the kind of community art space.
Wow, you're right in the middle of it, aren't you?
Yeah, but I chose this as well. It interests me. Yeah,
absolutely. That is a really fascinating story of the background, because we do often acknowledge and we see people who come from different language or cultural backgrounds, but both parents are from that cultural background. But you actually, it wasn't your community where you had two cultures, it was actually within your home.
Yes, and that was hard. I think about how different it would have been. I do know some mixed race Indians who have Indian mothers and white fathers, and I think that plays out differently. I think women generally tend to move where their husbands live and work. So it plays out differently. My father was very strict as well. So it really played out in a very immediate kind of way in my family. I had a father who thought he was extremely liberated, but actually still held on to some very traditional ideas about women, and, you know, other kinds of ideas from India. And then I had my mum who played good cop to my dad's bad cop. So it was, you know, my teen years were really tough, and I really didn't like my father a lot when I was growing up, and I really shunned the kind of Indian side of me. I was very embarrassed by it. But of course, as you get older, you start to embrace it a lot more, which is precisely the theme of Here Out West, my chapter, which I know you've seen, which is really wonderful that you've seen the film.
Yeah, so let's talk then about your chapter, because I can see there's obviously a lot of your own personal experience. It's not exactly your story, but a lot of your own personal experience in that. So how did you come to write that chapter?
Yes. So I always start off by saying it is a work of fiction. You know, it's not a documentary. It's a work of fiction. I invented the characters, but it was based on what I was going through at the time. So I was recruited to the project. They were looking for culturally and linguistically diverse writers, filmmakers and actors from Western Sydney. I'm a writer and a filmmaker. I'd made some short films and with multicultural content. They brought us all into a room. They told us, we kind of thought we'd just be doing a web series that no one would watch. You know, it was really exciting that they pushed for a feature film. But in the early days, it was just, okay, what's the story you guys want to tell? And can we find some connections between all of them? Because we were all so different. We were a really, really different, very diverse cross-section of Western Sydney. And at the time, my father had a stroke in the end of 2015, and he reverted to his native tongue, which is Bengali, which I don't speak because I grew up with a white mother, and, you know, we didn't speak my father's language. And this was very painful for me because I started to really wish I had learnt the language, but also I just thought about how lonely my father must have been, that he was sort of, you know, deteriorating and had no one to talk to. And I just sort of thought, you know, this decision, we're very mean to migrants who don't speak perfect English. We're really unkind to kind of old ladies in the supermarket that might be buying something and need someone to translate for them. But I don't think there's much discussion as what that actually costs people. So this idea that assimilation bites you as you get older, I think is really interesting. So my father's assimilation, the fact that he married a white woman and assimilated and didn't push too hard on the language, really caught up with him in his old age. But my assimilation, my shunning of my Indian culture caught up with me as an adult when I now felt very disconnected from my father. So that's what I was going through at the time. My father was still alive. He died while the film in 2020, so before the film went in production, but he was very ill. And on the first day of the writer's room, I met Arka, and there was a young man who was an actor and happened to be a really good Bengali speaker. Arka's Bengali is excellent and had 2 Bengali parents. And I kind of was sensing that he would probably want to act in the film, and he had this story about young men. And I just sort of thought that this was actually a really beautiful kind of platonic relationship from 2 people at different stages in their assimilation, a kind of Gen X woman and a kind of young man who bond. And his sort of superpower is that he speaks his parents' language. He's someone who probably doesn't think he's very good at anything much, but he's got this extraordinary thing that helps this woman in her hour of need. Yes. And that was where it came from. So it came from a personal place, but it is absolutely 100% a work of fiction. But I just sort of thought it hadn't been explored very much. Films about migration that I had seen, even about South Asians, even about Indians, it was always like, oh, I went to school and my food smelled funny and I felt really out of place. And I think that's the kind of adolescent preoccupation. But as you move into adulthood, it changes and you don't care about fitting in anymore. You actually really start to want to embrace your culture.
Yes, exactly. I'll come back to that scene in the movie a minute because it was just beautiful. But before that, one of the things that we have spoken about with a few people is this different view of people, parents, particularly migrant parents or refugee parents, who either do or don't teach their children their native language. And my personal background, I'm an academic in applied linguistics, and so I'm always championing teach your kids your home language. Is my own personal view, but a lot of families think, well, no, you're in Australia now, you've got to learn English to get ahead, etc., and fear that speaking the mother tongue or one of the 2 mother tongues in your case at home might somehow disadvantage them. Now, as an academic, I can state the evidence clearly shows that doesn't happen. There is no disadvantage, so let's put that out there. But for you personally, the thing that you've told through that story is what can go wrong if you actually don't. You actually miss some really critical parts of your family life if you don't speak.
There's so much. Look, and I can speak about my experience. So my story is very sad. My older sister was actually quite bilingual as a little girl. My father spoke to her only in Bengali and she was speaking back. There is a really gorgeous video of the 2 of us as little girls in my parents' old house in Indian traditional gear, playing with dolls. And my father is talking to my sister in Bengali and she's answering fluently back. And what happened was they lived at that time, they moved to Western Sydney later on, but at that time we lived closer to the inner city in a very white neighborhood, and my sister was friends with the boy next door, and my father overheard her saying to him, "Oh, my dad doesn't speak English, so you're going to have to speak via me." Now my dad was like, he was also an academic, his field was political economy, and he spoke good academic English. He researched and published in English. His English was fine, and he was so offended that his young daughter could misunderstand the situation and think that he actually didn't speak any English because she only spoke to her in Bengali, that he stopped trying. And I've challenged him on this as an adult. I said, "Baba, she was 5 years old. Kids say things. My kids say things that upset me all the time. You know, Mummy, you've gotten fat. You know, Mummy, that doesn't look good." Like, I mean, my kids say things to me all the time. Kids say stuff. And that he was so offended by that. And that obviously he felt his standing here was so precarious that actually just really upset him. And he kind of never recovered from it. But even in my husband's family, like, I always thought this was a unique thing to me as a mixed race person. But I can tell you that, you know, my husband has a white father and a Filipino mother, and he doesn't speak Tagalog. And his cousins, he has many cousins that have two Filipino parents, and they only one of them speak fluent Tagalog, speak and listen beautifully. Even the ones who were born in the Philippines and came here as small children with two Filipino parents only speak English, and they miss out. There are jobs that are going that call for people who are multilingual, and they can't apply for them. But it's even richer than that. Like, I mean, there's such a tendency to view things through a sort of capitalist lens, but I think about what I missed out on, and I wanted to explore that in my chapter. It's not just conversational Bengali, it's literature and it's poetry and it's music. My grandmother had an arranged marriage when she was 13 in India, and she kept copious diaries in Bengali. She didn't speak a word of English. And I just feel like what I've missed out on because my dad was embarrassed by his 5-year-old daughter. And can I say this? Even I've observed with people with two parents, it is hard. You've got to keep it. The parents have to make a concerted effort. They either have to make a concerted effort or have no choice. They have to just not speak English. I find they just have to, like, it's sink or swim. And then they have to keep it up. And the children have to have an interest as well, because you'll get parents who speak to their children in their native tongue, and the children are rebellious and speak back in English, either because it's easier or because they're just annoyed with their parents, and they're like, "Go away, I want to do this thing," and they speak in English. It's actually a lot of work to make your children bilingual, and it's something we don't really value because it is extraordinary. I mean, I work with 3 Latin women, and my closest colleague, whose family's from El Salvador, her Spanish is excellent, and it's because she didn't have a choice. Her parents did not speak a word of English, and so everything was in Spanish. Whereas my other colleague sort of can speak it with her grandparents, but not really as well. And I even just think about the richness of experience that they get. And of course, Matthias on our team, his Spanish is absolutely excellent. In a way that even a lot of Chilean first generation young people that I meet, it's not as good as Matthias's would be. So there's enormous variety, and I feel like there needs to be a shift in thinking, and migrant parents need to see the value in teaching your children their native tongue, even if you are good English speakers. I think that's what it is. It's the ones who children speak good parents' language if they just didn't have a choice and they just kind of had to do it. But if the parents speak some English, I feel like that's when the parents start to rest on it a bit, or they start to think, "Oh, I don't want my kid to be."
Yeah. And it's good to be realistic about it. It is, to totally agree with you, it is hard work. And it's got to be a commitment, and it's only going to happen if people see the value in it. What is the value? And I think it would be true to say in Australia, in the past, bilingualism wasn't valued. And so, perhaps 20, 30 years ago, there would have been a sense of, it's not going to help you at all. But I'm happy to say my feeling here in Australia is that bilingualism is becoming more recognised and appreciated as a skill, not just be able to speak another language, but as, and excuse me for sounding a little bit like an academic here, but the cognitive abilities are different. And so there are metacognitive advantages. The way you think is enhanced if you have 2 languages, because you're actually able to see things in 2 different ways.
I can, as a monolingual person, I can see that as well. Look, there's a joke that they say, "What's something that's classy when you're rich and not when you're poor?" And the answer is speaking 2 languages. So if you're a rich person who speaks French, that's seen as desirable. But if you're a poor person who maybe speaks Arabic or Spanish or Hindi, that's seen as, povo and not really that's desirable. And also, I mean, how many people are screamed at? You hear it every day on trains. trains and supermarkets at schools and told, speak English, you're in Australia now.
Yeah.
And when I was growing up, that was common. I heard it in my school. My very multicultural school still had girls getting screamed at by other girls because they spoke Korean or whatever their first language was. You know, and this is the thing. I feel like I wanted to write a kind of challenge to this idea that assimilation is, firstly, I want to challenge this idea that migrants don't assimilate. We all do. We assimilate in ways that are not visible to the naked eye. Even somebody who maybe hasn't mastered English as a language has given up so much of who they are to live in Australia. And that's the first thing. But second thing is like, well, you know, is it really that desirable? Yes, you'll be a cool white kid in your teen years, and maybe employers will look at you differently because you speak with an Australian accent, but you've also lost a lot, and reconnecting with what people lost.
Yeah, we can continue this campaign.
Look, I really want to say this. My chapter, when people watch it, I want people to go and learn their parents' language, okay? And if they learn it if they know it at a conversational level, learn it at a university level, and connect with your elders and read literature in your parents' language. Honestly, it's just, it'll give you such a richer experience of life. And I wanted that particularly for young migrant kids. I want that to be the provocation of my chapter, The Eternal Dance.
Yeah, and I believe that message comes through really, really beautifully. So well done. That was a fantastic job in writing a story that not only gives the message but brings the emotion along with it, and you really feel for Ash and the situation, and you actually think, oh, I wish you could learn that language, which is, I guess it's the message and the heart you wanted together. That's what writing's about, isn't it?
Well, so you know, I didn't actually get to explain what it's about. I mean, The Eternal Dance is about a woman in her 40s, in a mixed race Indian Australian woman, who is with her father on his last legs, and he makes a deathbed confession in Bengali, which she doesn't speak. That's the hook. I wanted to take the situation that I was in and make it kind of very operatic and Shakespearean, and on a kind of Indian cinematic tropes, which are, you know, redemption through singing and dance, without giving too much away. And also honoring your parents is a very common theme of Indian cinema. So I wanted to put that in there, even though it's quite a contemporary, fresh look at Australian life. You know, I thought it was important that I acknowledged my roots in that way. Yeah,
it was beautiful. And the other really beautiful thing, I think, as I said, coming back to that story, was towards the end, where you have a young man, a young character, the young man who played the character of Robbie, who was really not sure about his identity, and in being able to help, like that language being a superpower, it was a mutual benefit, wasn't it? It's like he was, will I, won't I, do I buy the condensed milk for my mum? Sorry, I'm not giving away too much of that.
My favourite scene in the whole thing. It is the most beautiful, poetic little scene, because he gets it now.
Yes.
And that's what I wanted. I wanted to have a young man who was ambivalent about his culture, and, you know, lying to his parents about being at university and you know, dealing with generational issues, find strength in his culture, and he gets it by the time he's finished with her. He gets the message of respecting your elders, the one that she felt she came to too late. So, and I think it's really beautiful and really kind of unexplored. And I just think Arka and Leah are absolutely breathtaking. And Sukraj, the gentleman who played the father, just three brown actors on screen in Australia getting such meaty roles. It's really beautiful.
It's beautiful. So I think, well, I personally want to congratulate you for having done that so beautifully in such a short. It's just one small chapter one chapter in this beautiful film, but that message came through with power, with passion, and well, I'll confess, I did actually cry at the end there of that scene, because it's very, very beautiful.
I always say, people say to me, I get lots of people saying, oh my, you made me cry. And I never know whether to say thank you or sorry, but I just say, I never set out to make people cry. I might be an Indian mother and I'm a Cancer, but I don't set out to emotionally blackmaul people. But all I did was tell my truth, and it is quite moving.
Bina, it was just a beautiful story. That's
please, I mean, you know, please catch the film. It's coming out, you know, on the 3rd of February, which is not this Thursday but the Thursday after. And you know, it's such an unusual film, and it really needs people to come and support it. But I also think for anyone, what's impressed me about the film so far is that even though we've written about our specific cultures, I find people not from the cultures represented in the films, they still find something to identify with, and even Anglo-Australians seem to be finding something to enjoy about the film. So you know, it's I think it's very, very extraordinary and deserves a wide audience.
And I totally agree with you. I'll be back to see it again for sure. It's been lovely chatting with you, Bina. Thank you so much.
It's been lovely to chat. Thank you. This is a really beautiful idea for a podcast. And yes, spread the word that, speak your parents' language, speak many languages. It'll make you a better thinker.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Bina.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Who is My Neighbour? To learn more about the work of You Belong Australia, just head to youbelong.org.au and find out all the ways you can get involved and empower refugees to integrate and thrive. Lastly, would you help support this podcast simply by sharing it with others? You can also write a review on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, or subscribe to us on YouTube. Yes, we are a video podcast as well. Well, thanks again for listening. We hope you enjoyed this episode of Who is My Neighbour?